So here it is, our last study in the Old Testament, our last reading. And it was a tough one, but we'll pray and then we'll get going on it. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Dear God in heaven, we cannot thank you enough for the warmer weather and for our Bible study and for your revelation through sacred scripture. Just open up our minds, our hearts, and help us through 1 Maccabees. Tough reading, Lord. It's like reading a history book, really. We love you, and we will get going with your sacred word. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so sharing my screen. We will go to 1 Maccabees. Chapters 1 through 16, which is the entire book, and probably the hardest reading that you guys have done so far. But as always, we start with our review. So this time, I'll close my eyes to show you, I really do have this memorized. And today in our morning class, a couple of people repeated it with me from memory. So it works, I'm telling you. Creation, fall, flood, nations. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Redemption, revelation, sacrifice, sanctification, tribes, tragedy, transition, coverage, command, covenants, conquest, settlement, cycles, love. Samuel, Saul, David, united, divided, divided, surviving. And that's where we're starting today, is with a surviving nation, right? They, when we left off last class 2 weeks ago, we left off with Ezra and Nehemiah. And we read about how the Persian King Cyrus helped Zerubbabel rebuild the temple, that God actually came to this pagan and said, let my people go back to Jerusalem and help them rebuild their temple. And Cyrus did that. And here you get an idea from this map what the Persian Empire looked like back in 515 BC. And that's about when Ezra and Nehemiah were doing their thing, right? Zerubbabel rebuilds in 537 BC. He rebuilds the temple. Ezra comes back to teach the Torah in 458 BC, and Nehemiah rebuilds the walls in about 440 BC. And then the chosen people go quiet. They go quiet for almost 300 years while they live under various empires, and we don't hear anything about them until the Maccabean revolt, which is in 167 BC. So while we don't know much about what went on with the chosen people during those interim years, a lot goes on in the world. And if you don't understand what goes on in the world, it makes it a lot harder to understand the book of Maccabees. So we're going to do a quick trip through history. So the Persian Empire is this huge, strong empire, but the first sign that it's weakening, as all empires do, is that over here you have what's turning out to be an empire made up of Greek city-states. And those city-states include Syracuse and Sparta and Athens and Thebes, which is not on this map, but would be right in here, north of the Gulf of Corinth, which is this long strip of water right here. And this Greece was like an experiment in democracy, right? They had different forms of government in the different city-states, and the different city-states were not united. Athens had closest to what was a pure democracy, where every Greek men had a vote, right? And if they got together a jury to try somebody, what they did was they asked for 500 men. They drew lots from all of those who volunteered, and those would be who made up the court, right? Um, Sparta had two kings who were equal. Syracuse, I can't remember what their government form was, but all of them had different types of governments and different areas of influence. So Sparta was known for its military. And in Sparta, you really didn't want to be a mother with a son, because the reason Sparta was known for its military was if you had a baby boy, the government immediately took it away and started training it for the military. They raised all male children. The women were really there to give birth to soldiers. So they were known for their military might. Athens, on the other hand, was known for both its democratic government and its intellectual curiosity. Philosophy is born in Athens. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, right? They're wondering what is truth? How do you find truth? How is it that the human intellect works, right? They start examining all these philosophical questions. What does it mean to be a human being? So they have these great soldiers that are there, and the Persian Empire actually hires some mercenaries to go on an expedition. And so they're called hoplites. They were foot soldiers, very, very well practiced. And they're hired, and the Persian king comes along with them to go on this expedition, but he dies. And when he dies, all the rest of the group breaks apart. But you've got these 10,000 hoplites who are now basically trapped in Persia. And now that the king is gone, nobody's very friendly to them. And so they decide still to explore the Persian Empire. They fight their way through the Persian Empire, never being able to be defeated by this massive population, which also is known for its fighting, but they just couldn't contend with the hoplites. Their armor, their strategies were so good. So these 10,000 men make it all the way through the Persian Empire, 25,000 miles, and they're almost unscathed. And that happens in 401 BC. So the Persian Empire is getting weaker, but the problem that these Greek city-states, they all fight amongst themselves all the time. So they can't really go over here and take it over because they're all fighting. Now, just north of Greece is a place called Macedon. And Macedonia is where Alexander the Great is going to be born. Now, Macedonia was different in its government in that it had a single king, and that single king had full authority. The only thing he needed permission from the assembly was if he wanted to put another Macedonian citizen to death. Then he had to get the assembly's concurrence. Everything else was made, all decisions were made by one person, which tends to lead to a very strong country. So if we jump now from the 500s BCs to 323 BC, you get a picture of what the empire of Alexander looked like. We've all heard of Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great was born to King Philip, who was the king of Macedonia. And at the age of 20, he becomes the king of Macedon. And as a child, this is really important, he was tutored by Aristotle, right? Alexander is, nobody like him has again existed in this world. A curious man, a brilliant man, always seeking reasonable answers to questions because he's schooled by Aristotle. And when Alexander takes over the kingship of Macedon at age 20, the world to him seems like it has no direction or purpose. And so he intends to give it a whole new purpose. He's also a great explorer. He gets together a very powerful army and he just starts conquering the world. And his idea is that he's not going to conquer like the countries of old. He's not going to make slaves out of everybody. He's not going to steal all their possessions. He's going to Hellenize them, right? He is Greek in his training because Aristotle was Greek. And he's just going to spread Hellenism. And by changing the culture of the people to getting them to buy in to the greater breadth of thinking that the Greeks had and their different culture, he's going to hold them together that way. He's not going to steal all their money. He's not going to put everybody to death. Not to say that he's not going to take money and that he's not going to kill people, but not like the rulers of old. And so he goes out, he makes this massive empire, but unfortunately, and one of the things about when he conquers, whoever he conquers is on equal footing with the Greeks. So Greek, Persian, doesn't matter. Once you're conquered, you become Hellenized and you have an equal say. And so he's not leaving garrisons everywhere. He's just leaving basically councils that are going to keep these countries on this Greek Hellenization. So the only problem is that he dies at age 23 or age 33. So he's king at 20, dies at 33, 13 years. He's an empire builder. Notice on this map also that between 500 and 323, our last map and this map, Rome has come onto the stage. Very small right now. It's just in its infancy. When Alexander dies, he leaves only a posthumous son, a son that's born after his death, and an illegitimate imbecile half-brother. And so they would be the heirs to his throne. However, both of them are murdered, one of them by their grandmother, and the other by one of the Greek generals that wanted to become the next king of a great empire. So the empire is divided up between Greek generals. And by the year 305 BC, the generals that divided up are Seleucus in Babylon, Ptolemy in Egypt, Cassandra in Macedon, and Lysimachus in Thrace. And so if you look over at this map, you see here's the king of Seleucus. His kingdom goes from this line right here all the way over here. King of Ptolemy, king of Antigonus, king of Cassandra right here. Well, so now you've got all of these Greek generals that are have split the empire apart and are ruling it. So in the year 270 BC, we move forward again. You can see that the chosen people right here, this little blue dot where my pointer is, that's the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Jordan River flowing down into the Dead Sea. And you can see that they're part of the Ptolemaic kingdom in this year. And the other thing that you can really see on this map is that the Roman Empire is starting to grow. It went from little teeny tiny letters to bigger letters. Carthage also, substantial force in the world. Now, Carthage was a really radical pagan nation, known for sacrificing infants to gods and sacrificing humans to God, and all sorts of other just almost demonic type things. Carthage was, if anything, a very, of all the places, the most evil of places. So now we jump to 220 BC. By 220 BC, the Seleucid kingdom is now creeping down. You can see it's starting to take over the Ptolemaic kingdom in this southern area right here, and has actually gotten down to the Sea of Galilee. So Rome, now a growing empire. And you can see that now the Jews are really getting introduced to another Greek king, right? All the kings of these places, they're all Greeks. They were all Greek generals, but they really don't, the chosen people really don't like being led by the king of Egypt, who still calls himself a pharaoh. So, but he happens to be a Greek pharaoh, and he's very, very hard, takes huge tributes from them. And so they think they'll be better off if they're part of the Seleucid kingdom. So in 200 BC, the Jews helped Antiochus III expel the Egyptian garrison from the citadel in Jerusalem. What had happened was that the Greek king, Pharaoh of Egypt, had decided to build a big, huge fortress called the Citadel, or Acra, right next to the temple, so that they could look down and see what the Jewish people were up to when they were worshiping. And so Antiochus III, who was the king of the Seleucid kingdom, expels the Egyptians from the citadel in Jerusalem, and he gives the scribes special status. So in terms of fairness of dictator rulers, he was fairer than the Ptolemaic king. So you say, well, what's Rome doing this whole time, right? You said they were a growing kingdom. Well, Rome is tied up. It doesn't, the only one that it can really deal with is Carthage, because Carthage decided, and their leader was Hannibal, right? Any of you who've seen Silence of the Lamb, Hannibal the cannibal in Silence of the Lamb, there was a reason that Hollywood named him Hannibal, because Hannibal was a merciless terror. He was just a bringer of terror. And what he did was he took an enormous army and a bunch of war elephants and marched them through what we now know as Spain, all the way up through a mountain pass, and attacked Rome. And so this war between Carthage and Rome is called the Punic War. And in fact, they're called the Punic Wars because there are actually 3 wars that come close upon each other. And this map is during the Second Punic War. But ultimately, Rome wins the Punic War, but the last battle is fought in 146 BC. So Rome doesn't have time to do a lot of other things to its east, because it has to contend with Hannibal first and Carthage. So by 192 BC, right now we're slipping towards the date of the Maccabean revolt. It was in 167. In 192 BC, this is what the map looks like. Now you can see clearly Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. It's all part of the Seleucid kingdom. But the problem is Antiochus III is now dead. And Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, decides that he is going to invade the Ptolemaic kingdom. And he's going to besiege Alexandria, which is down here. And the Ptolemies appeal to Rome at about 168 BC. And what Rome does, right, it's it sends a council, a Roman ex-council. Rome is ruled by two counselors, and they only are there councils, and they're only the head of the nation for 1 year. So these two men rule together 1 year, then two new men step in. And that's how Rome's government was set up. Then it had a Senate and other ruling bodies and relationships between them. Of all the government systems, you would recognize Rome's more like ours. So they took one of their ex-councils, they send them down to Alexandria to meet up with Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And they tell him to knock it off, to cease and desist, that he's not going to take over the Ptolemaic kingdom. And he says, well, I would like to sleep on this. I'm going to leave and deliberate. And this old ex-council who said he actually walks with a walking stick. He's so old. He draws a circle in front of all of Antiochus's troops. He draws a circle around him and he says, deliberate here, right? i.e., you make up your mind now or you die. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes is humiliated in front of all of his troops, and he goes mad. And all the kings of the Seleucid kingdom were considered gods when they were kings, right? But they all knew they were really human. But Antiochus IV Epiphanes, after this drawing of the circle around him, he goes mad and he really thinks he is a god. And so with that background, we are now ready to jump into the first chapter of Maccabees. So Antiochus Epiphanes in the Holy Land. It was Hellenization, as I discussed before, that held the Greek kingdoms together, right? You go in and you change the culture of all these people who live in these foreign lands, and you get them to want to be Greek. And so some Jews were all for taking on Gentile customs, right? And we're told in the first chapter that these Jews who wanted to really become Greeks, they wanted to become Gentiles, they would hide their circumcision and they built a gymnasium, right? Because in the gymnasium, you had all these athletic events where people competed and beautiful bodies because you competed naked, and they didn't want anybody to know that they were Jewish. So they hid their circumcisions and they gave up the covenant, right? They didn't want to be Jews anymore. So Antiochus Epiphanes pillages the temple, and 2 years later, he has a bigger, better citadel or acra built next to it again, so he can watch what's going on. But now he's going to watch him doing something way different in the temple, because he orders the Jews to renounce their customs on pain of death. And we're told that he builds an appalling abomination on Yahweh's altar. Now, what this appalling abomination is probably an altar to Zeus, or a statue of Zeus, or maybe to Dagon, but it was the god that Antiochus Epiphanes thought he was on earth. And he burned the book of the law, he burned the Torah. And if he found that some baby had been circumcised, he killed the baby and then hung it around its mother's neck. And then he killed the person who circumcised the baby. He was a crazy man. But many in Israel still stood firm, we're told. So in chapter 2, we're told about a man named Mattathias who starts a holy war. Mattathias is living in Jerusalem, right? But Antiochus Epiphanes has desolated the temple now. And so Mattathias decides to leave Jerusalem for Modin. He has 5 sons: John, Simon or Simeon, Judas Maccabeus, Eleazar, and Jonathan. And so now this whole family is living in Modin, but some of the king's men come to Modin because they want every single part of the kingdom to worship the same way, and basically to worship Antiochus Epiphanes. And so they try to get Mattathias, because he's an elder and he's respected by all the Jews there, to make an offering to this foreign god, but he won't do it. And another Jew comes walking along and he does make an offering. And so Mattathias kills him. And then he kills all the king's men too. And then he knows, I am in trouble. I better get out of Modin. So he heads for the hills, and everybody who agrees with him heads for the hills with him. Now, some of those who try to follow him are killed by the king's soldiers, who are now rushing in to Modin and now looking for Mattathias and his sons. These people refuse to fight on the Sabbath because, of course, that's against the Torah, right? That's a day of rest, the Sabbath is. But the Greek soldiers who come, the Greek army that comes, they don't care about the Sabbath. So they slaughter these people. And so Mattathias and his sons meet with all these people, and they decide that it's God's will that if somebody attacks them on the Sabbath, they will fight. So he and his sons unite with the Hasidians and become a very effective army. And they start forcibly returning Jews to the covenant, right? The Greeks can't be everywhere. And so here you've got basically a guerrilla army moving through and turning people back towards the covenant. Now, as Mattathias dies, he summarizes salvation history, right? He's just an old man. He gets old. He's dying. He summarizes salvation history and all the heroes, all of them who we would recognize now, Abraham, Isaac, right? And he makes Simeon, his son, the wise father, because Simeon's known for his wisdom. And he makes Judas Maccabeus the commander of the army, because Judas Maccabeus was a great warrior. So in chapters 3 and 4, the Maccabees retake the temple. And how that happens is that Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, heads to Persia. He's worried because he's running out of fancy gifts to give people to bribe them to do what he wants. So he's like, I'm going to take off to Persia. I got to get some more wealth here. And so he leaves half his army with his generals there in the Holy Land. And he tells them, take care of the Maccabees, get rid of these guys. Now the Maccabees, right, they're hugely outnumbered by these armies that are coming at them. But every time before they fight a battle, they pray to Yahweh, they fast, they call Jews to arms, fellows who also are devout to Yahweh and trust in Yahweh. And in 3 separate battles that are described, the Maccabees win, even though they're hugely outnumbered, right? They have the heart and the soul, and they have Yahweh behind them. In 164, they retake the temple and they cleanse it. And they don't even try to bother to cleanse the altar, right? Because this abomination has been on the altar and offerings have been made to this abominable god. And so they simply disassemble it and get the stones away, as far away from the temple as they can. And they bring brand new stones in and build a brand new altar. They bring back all the sacred furniture. And then they celebrate for 8 days. And this celebration is in remembrance of the cleansing of the temple. And we now call it Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah with its menorah and 8 candles, right? And it's the celebration of lights, right? 8 days that you celebrate, that were celebrated back in those days when the temple was retaken, and then a tall center candle. So that's where Hanukkah comes from. It's from this retaking of the temple and the celebration of it. Now, this picture I included because now we're going to start hearing all the time about war elephants and phalanxes. A phalanx is a military a way of fighting a war where you get very close together and you have very, very long spears and you have shields that you can hold up all together. And so you basically form this shielded line. You're wearing armor, you're helmeted, and you lower these swords or spears so that they're out in front of you and you charge at your enemies. You can kill cavalry, you can kill other people. It's a very formidable formation. And even the troops are spaced out. It was always veteran warriors who were on the ends. And then they could be much longer lines than this, but they'd have veterans spaced in between the newer troops because they would know how to fight better, and they'd keep them in check, right, from chickening out. The war elephants garbed in armor, 4 people usually on top of them, terrifying in war, right? The elephants are screaming, they're very well trained, they charge. And usually you would have several sets of these phalanxes surrounding the elephants. So that's the type of battle that the Maccabees are fighting against. In chapters 5 and 6, we're told that their old enemies rise up against the Maccabees, but the brothers split up, and their old enemies include like the Moabites and all of the Philistines, the Ammonites, all those people we've talked about before. They don't like them having the temple cleansed and worshiping there again. And but the brothers split up and go to Gilead and Galilee, and they free all the Jews there and bring them back to Jerusalem. Antiochus Epiphanes has gone back to Persia to get these riches, but he's defeated while he's trying to plunder a city in Persia. And he hears of what's going on in Judah. Now he's been beaten, right? God has been beaten. And he hears in Judah that his troops, his generals, are being defeated by the Maccabees. And so he loses heart and he dies. And he has a general there with him in where he is. And he tells the general that's with him to get his son, also named Antiochus, and get him on the throne. But right, he left a general in Jerusalem, and that was where his son was. So his general, who's in Judah, sets up Antiochus Eupator to rule. So this is the son of the crazy Antiochus, and just a young kid. So while all of this is happening, Judas Maccabeus attacks the citadel, right? This huge fortress that's been built next to the temple. And the Hellenized Jews run away to Syria to tell the new king, Antiochus Eupator, what has happened. And so then the Greeks send an army to fight Judas Maccabeus. He leaves Jerusalem and changes the battle to Beth Zechariah. And Eleazar dies during this, right? There are these war elephants, they're the phalanxes, you see these troops coming at you. Eleazar sees this elephant that's bigger than all the other elephants, and he thinks to himself, I'll bet that's the king on that elephant. And so he rushes through the phalanx, the soldiers, worms his way underneath this elephant, stabs it and kills it, and it falls on him and kills him. And so his body is recovered, and he is sent back are taken back to Modin to be buried. And then the fighting moves back to the sanctuary. The general who was with the dying king in Persia, he now returns to the Holy Land too. And he goes to war with the general who had stayed in Judah and had put Antiochus Eupator back on the throne. So, right, these generals, this is just a young kid, the king is. And so they would be the ones who were really the rulers until he got older. And so they go to war with each other. In chapters 7 through 8, we get a new Greek king, right? Another royal heir, right? Because these guys have plenty of sons, and these sons are in different parts of the world. And this heir, Demetrius, decides that he is going to be the Seleucid king. So he kills the Greek general and that's with Antiochus Eupator, and he kills Antiochus Eupator. And he makes a guy named Bacchides the governor of Judah. And he makes Alchemist, who's a fallen away Jew, right? He's a lawless Jew. He doesn't follow the covenant anymore. He makes him the high priest. And but these two, they go to the Holy Land and they go to Jerusalem, but they're so afraid of Judas Maccabeus that they run away. They run back to the king who's in Syria, Demetrius. And so Demetrius now sends another army commander named Nicanor. And Nicanor comes into Jerusalem, and the priests in the temple actually approach him peaceably, right? They don't want to fight. They're not fighters. But he derides them, and he is really nasty to them. Judas Maccabeus hears about him, and he routs this mighty army that Nicanor has brought with him, with the help of the Lord, of course. Again, fasting, prayer, trust in the Lord. Meanwhile, Judas sends 2 of his nephews to Rome to make an alliance with Rome. Rome is this growing empire, right? They're just finishing up dealing with Carthage. They've got this expanding empire, and Judas wants them to be on his side because he's got all these Greek kings that keep putting the Jews down, keeping them under this terrible taxation system where they can never get on their feet, and basically treating them as slaves. So a treaty is brokered, and Rome waves off, that should say off, Demetrius. They tell him, leave the Jews alone. Of course, they don't send an army, so Demetrius really ignores them. In chapter 9, the lawless Jews make trouble, these guys who wanted to build the gymnasium. Bacchides and Alchemists are sent back to Judah from Syria, where they ran away to, with a very powerful army. In fact, when Judas's men see this army that's with them, they just kind of melt away, right? Those in the back ranks are just like peeling off and going home because they're afraid. And Judas Maccabeus is only left with 800 men. And he says to these men, if our time has come, let us die bravely for our brethren and leave no cause to question our honor. Right? It's almost kind of heartbreaking. I mean, they do a great job, these 800 men, but they do die. And Judas Maccabeus with them. So Jonathan takes Judas's place, and he becomes the next leader of the army. And his brother John is killed by the Nabateans. Now, the Nabateans were friends with the Maccabees and with the Jews, but they were having this big wedding celebration, and Jonathan wanted John to take all the baggage that they had. They needed to lighten themselves up, and he wanted John to just leave the baggage with the Nabateans until they could come and recover it. Well, the Nabateans decide that they want the baggage and they don't want John at all, so they kill him, and then his brothers avenge them, which we read about. Meanwhile, Bacchides, this governor that has been uh, made for Jerusalem, he goes around to all these Jewish cities, fortifying them, including Jerusalem. And Alchemist, meanwhile, decides he's right, he's the high priest and he's got the temple now. So he decides he's going to take down the inner wall of the sanctuary. But that's where the Holy of Holies is, right? The inner wall of the sanctuary. He's going to mess with it. And he starts taking it apart, but then he dies a tremendously agonizing death. And so it's so agonizing that Bacchides decides that he's going to return to the king in Syria. And he does. He returns to the king, but then a bunch of unholy Jews, these lawless men, come and they convince him, no, come back. You can beat the Maccabees now. But that's not true. Jonathan and Simon thwart this new attack on the Jewish people, and Bacchides now decides, we are never going to win this, and so I'm just going to make peace and go back to Syria. And so he does. So then another Greek heir, Alexander Epiphanes, comes to claim the Seleucid kingdom. So right now you've got Demetrius, who's ruling the Seleucids, and he sees Alexander Epiphanes come into his territory, and he goes to the Maccabees, who have been his terrible enemies, right? He's the one who chose Bacchides and Alchemists to go there. He's no friend of Jonathan, but he decides to become a friend, right? And that's one of the things you see in Maccabees. You see all these shifting relationships between the countries. So Demetrius asks Jonathan to help him, and Jonathan says, well, if you release the prisoners that are in the citadel, this great big huge fortress, I'll give you a hand. And so he releases the prisoners, and Jonathan rebuilds and restores Jerusalem. And he has all the foreigners leave because he doesn't want them in Jerusalem. And then Jonathan switches sides because Alexander comes to him and offers him the high priesthood, right? That's what Alchemist had, but he's gone now. And so Alexander gives him, these robes of a high priest, and he says, you can be the high priest. And when Demetrius hears about it, he tries to sweeten up the offer, right? He says, well, I'll give you all these things. You could be high priest. I'll give you fancy clothes too. And I'll do away with all your tributes, and I'll help you rebuild everything you want to rebuild. And Jonathan, he recognizes these are lies, and I'm not doing it. And so Demetrius is killed when he's fighting with Alexander. So now Alexander Epiphanes is the king of the Seleucid Empire. So then Alexander marries Ptolemy's daughter, Cleopatra. Ptolemy is the king of the Ptolemaic kingdom, which is Egypt, right? And he's actually a pharaoh, right? And it's funny because you always think of pharaohs as being Egyptian, but we saw that earlier, right, in the Old Testament when the pharaohs were not really Egyptians, they were another nationality. Well, now the pharaohs are Greek, and Ptolemy is the pharaoh, and he wants to marry his daughter to Alexander so that they can unite these two empires, essentially. And Ptolemy's a calculating man, so he's got his head thinking, how can I be more powerful? So he has his daughter, who's also Greek, Cleopatra, marry Alexander. And Jonathan is honored as a chief friend of the new king, Alexander Epiphanes. They have a great big huge wedding, big huge festival. Jonathan's there. But Demetrius's son, who's also named Demetrius, right? We don't have a lot of change up in names here. Demetrius's son, Demetrius, tries to do a comeback, but Jonathan and Simon defeat him. So Alexander Epiphanes remains the king. In chapter 11, that soap opera continues because Ptolemy, the king of the Pharaoh of Egypt, backstabs Alexander. Alexander's gone away to Cilicia because in Cilicia they're revolting. So Alexander's gone there to hold down this revolt, and he allies with Demetrius. Ptolemy does, and he says, you know, Alexander's gone. Demetrius, I want you, the younger Demetrius, to become the king. And I'm going to give you Cleopatra. I know that she was Alexander's wife that I gave him, but now I'm going to give her to you. And we will become the kings of Egypt and Asia. Of course, Alexander returns. He tries to fight Ptolemy, but he's defeated. And he ends up fleeing to Arabia, and he's killed there by the rulers of Arabia, and they cut off his head and hands, and they send them back to Ptolemy to show, hey, we killed this guy that you didn't like. But Ptolemy dies 3 days later, and so now the younger Demetrius becomes the king. So Alexander's dead, Ptolemy's dead, younger Demetrius has become the king. Jonathan, meanwhile, while all of this is playing out, besieges the citadel, this big, huge fortress next to the temple. And the lawless Jews go to the new king and they complain. But right, Jonathan has one favor with Demetrius. And Demetrius says, no, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop making Judea and the 3 districts of Samaria that are associated with them free from all my tributes. And then he confirms Jonathan as the high priest of Judea. So then another general who was friends with the former Alexander, who was killed in Arabia, goes and gets Alexander's son, who happens to be named Antiochus. We don't want to change up these names. That would change, that would really not be as puzzling, right, if we had different names. No, Alexander has named his son Antiochus. And this general goes and gets him. So he's again a Greek general. He gets this young child and makes him the king. Meanwhile, Demetrius is really the king, and he's living in Antioch, but now nobody really likes him. His people don't, so his troops are turning on him. But he gets word to Jonathan that he needs help. And so Jonathan, one of the Maccabees, he sends troops to Antioch, and they save Demetrius. But then Demetrius backstabs him. He made all these promises to him, but then he decides not to keep them. So then Trypho goes to Antioch, and Antiochus makes Jonathan the high priest and Simon the governor. So again, you've got these changing relationships between the different kings. Demetrius has backstabbed Jonathan. So now Antiochus makes friends with him, and he says, okay, yeah, you are the high priest, and P.S., your brother Simon, he's going to be the governor. So then Jonathan defeats Demetrius in another unlikely win, right? He's tremendously outnumbered, but with Yahweh's help, he wins. In chapters 12 and 13, Judea actually gets its independence back. In those chapters, we're told that Jonathan renews his alliance with Rome and now Sparta. And Trypho attempts to become the king of Asia, and he deceives Jonathan. He gets Jonathan to come to him, and then he makes all these promises, says it's going to be peaceable, but he takes him captive. And so nobody knows that he's just a captive. They think he's already been killed. So his brother Simon takes command of the army. And Trypho says, I'll free Jonathan up. It's just that I need a bunch of money that hasn't been paid to us. And P.S., he won his 2 sons too. And so because Simon doesn't want people to say that he didn't try to keep the peace, he actually sends the money and the 2 sons, but Trypho kills Jonathan in Gilead, and Simon goes and gets his bones. He brings them back home, and he makes 7 pyramids, right? He makes 2 pyramids, one for his mother, one for his father, 4 for his brothers. The 7th will be for himself when he dies. So then Trypho, this Greek general, kills Antiochus. And so then Simon appeals to Demetrius, and Demetrius gives him freedom from the tributes, from all this taxation, and he actually says that Judah can be independent. He takes the foreign troops out of the citadel. I mean, they're still in the middle of the Seleucid Empire, but they're still in the middle of the Seleucid Empire, but they are independent. So he also, Jonathan makes his son John commander of all of the armed forces, or I should say Simon makes his son John commander of all the armed forces. So John is essentially now the Judas Maccabees, right? He's commanding all the armed forces. Everybody, all the brothers are dead except Simon. So in chapters 14 through 16, we learn that Judea is independent, but it is not at peace, right? The king of Persia takes Demetrius captive. And so Rome and Sparta have renewed their alliance. The people, because now that Judea is independent, they are absolutely in love with Simon Maccabeus, who was a great negotiator and a great leader of the army. And so they confirm him as high priest, right? It's like getting the vote. You were already made that by the king. You were told you were the high priest, but the people who are supposed to recognize you, it's a lot more important that they believe in you. So now the people confirm him as high priest and commander of the armed forces, and as their ethnarch, right? The governor of an ethnic group is called an ethnarch. So he becomes the ethnarch of the Jews and the priests. And he kicks all the foreigners out of the country again, right? You don't want them in there. You've now got your independence. Get the foreigners out of here. But there's yet another Antiochus the 7th, who's the king of the Seleucid kingdom now, who goes after Trypho. Trypho gets shut up in a city, but he ends up escaping. Rome, meanwhile, right, they've got this alliance with Judea, and they write to all these different countries, including the Seleucids, and they say, leave the Jews alone. But Antiochus VII goes to war with Judah anyway. But John, Simon's son, defeats them. And then Simon and his two sons are tricked by a Jewish wannabe high priest, wannabe all the things that Simon is, right? He invites them to come to a banquet. He gets them drunk, closes the banquet doors, and he kills Simon and his two sons. But John is not there, his son John, who's the commander of the army, and he now follows in his father's footsteps. And so ends 1Maccabees. So what's the importance of first, and we didn't read 2Maccabees, but it's more, to me, it's more interesting. It's more the more religious part of, you know, what's going on with the devout people who still worship Yahweh. But so the importance of these two books of Maccabees. The Maccabees established what's called the Hasmonean dynasty, right? They're now, Judea is now an independent country, and it now has its own leaders, but even though they're rulers, they're essentially kings of Judea, they're not of the Davidic line, right? All the prophets who were prophesying to the southern kingdoms and to the northern kingdoms before they were exiled to Assyria and Babylon, they are all prophesying that someday there will be a descendant of David who's going to rule forever. Well, the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees, they're not of the Davidic line of kings. They've also usurped the high priesthood from Aaron's line, right? Nobody is supposed to be a priest unless they've come out of the tribe of Aaron. The Levites work in the temple, and Aaron's direct disciples or descendants, they're the ones who are supposed to be the priests. So in this Hasmonean dynasty, the leadership becomes corrupt. They become Hellenized. The very thing that they were fighting against happens to them. They start turning towards the Greek culture. We are gonna, we won't see this, but you know of Herod the Great. Herod is the first Herod that's mentioned in the Bible, Herod the Great. He ruled from 36 BC to 1 BC. He was put in place by the Romans. Herod is also not of the line of David, even though he is going to be the ruler over Judea. But he's appointed by the Romans when they take over, and he's going to marry a Hasmonean princess, right? He's going to marry one of these women who's come down through the line of the Maccabees, and he's going to magnificently renovate the temple. But all the Jews, the real Jews, the ones who still worship Yahweh, which Herod the Great did not, they are going to hate him, and they're going to hate his wife, the Hasmonean princess. So that dynasty is going to, they're bound to fail, right? They're not what there is prophesied to be the coming, right? Because that's really Jesus Christ, who is of the line of David. The other thing that's important is we learn the power of martyrdom and redemptive suffering, especially in 2Maccabees. There is just a heart-wrenching story about a mother of 7 sons, and these 7 sons are told that they have to eat pork that's been sacrificed to these foreign gods. Well, number one, you can't, right? That's part of the law. You can't eat pork. And so the pain for, they do this knowing that the pain is going to be death. They're not going to do what these pagans are telling them to do. And so the mother's there with her 7 sons, and in Aramaic, she encourages them, right? The Greeks, they don't understand Aramaic, so they have no idea what this mother's saying to her sons, but she's encouraging them. And each of these sons gives these beautiful speeches as they're just about to undergo these horrendous tortures, which you can read about in 2 Maccabees. Um, but they talk about how they are shedding this blood for the redemption of their nation, and that this suffering that they're going through is restoring Judah to its rightful place. And that power of martyrdom, right? The Christian church is going to see that early on. When we start studying the history, you're going to see that Christianity is built on the blood of the martyrs. And you see a whisper of that here in 2 Maccabees. We also learn in 2 Maccabees about power for prayer for the dead. What happens is one of the Maccabean armies gets into this battle, and a bunch of these really wonderful soldiers are killed. So the Jews go out to collect the bodies of their brothers, and what they do is that they find these little idols hidden inside clothing, i.e., they were breaking the law, right? They were worshiping idols, whether they were good luck charms, whatever they were. It obviously was breaking the law of the Torah, but their general loved them, right? They were wonderful troops. They were brave and they were courageous, and they fought and gave their lives. And so he makes sacrifice and has the army pray for their fallen brothers. And so this power of prayer for the dead is evident there in 2 Maccabees. This time of the Maccabees, this 100-year span when Judea has its independence, is the seedbed for people we're going to hear about in the New Testament. We'll hear about the Sadducees. The Sadducees are Hellenized priestly class. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They were still kind of nominally Jewish, but they were very much into Greek culture. Now, opposite them are the Pharisees. Pharisee itself means separated ones, right? These are the guys who sought to maintain the purity of Israel's heritage and faith. They knew the Torah inside out and upside down. They knew when they needed to wash. They knew when they needed to make sacrifices. They knew all the laws, and that's how they got to holiness, right? They followed these laws to the tiniest little nit. Well, and they fought. These two, the Sadducees and Pharisees, hated each other's guts. Now, the Zealots were more like not intellectuals of the law so much. They were more like fighters, and they were motivated by the fact that the Maccabees had won all these battles when they were terribly outnumbered, basically through guerrilla warfare. So the Zealots are seeking to reestablish the independence of Judea from Rome by doing what the Maccabees did. Last but not least, we have the Qumran community, or the Essenes. The Essenes were the ones that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they moved out into the desert because of the temple and priesthood corruption. Right? Already we said that the Maccabees, the Maccabean high priest, through time, through this 100 years, becomes corrupt, and Qumran, the Essenes, were just like, we're out of here, right? we're not going to put up with all of this corruption. We're just going into the desert and become hermits. It's believed that John the Baptist was probably raised as an Essene. So, understanding of Jesus's teachings, we can see how Jesus would really have been influenced by reading what life was like in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. You know, he is in this tremendously violent environment. And so making peace and loving enemies, you can see why that would be such an importance for him to teach, right? This is something that the people would not have understood, and which would be breaking them apart and keeping them from God. His fellowship with sinners against the backdrop of the Pharisees' quest for purity, right? You're a Jew, you've got a growing family, you really need income, and somebody asks you if you want to become a tax collector. And so you become a tax collector, and now all your own people hate you, even though that's your job, right? Or you're just in hard times. The same thing happens here in the United States all the time. A woman's in hard times, she becomes a prostitute, right? And the Pharisees are like, you cannot be saved, you know, you're a tax collector, you're a prostitute, you cannot be saved. So Jesus is like, no, you're wrong. They can be saved. In fact, the tax collector will become one of my apostles, right? Matthew. A prostitute will become one of my greatest disciples, Mary Magdalene. Cleansing of the temple, right? Just like the Essenes moved into the desert because the temple and the priesthood were so corrupt, Jesus Christ will go into the temple and he will tip over the tables of the money changers, and he will tell them, this is a house of prayer, right? That's what it's meant to be. All of those things you start to understand by reading 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So this is what the world looked like. This is 145 BC, and that is just about the time that Judea became independent. And you can see they're still part of the Seleucid kingdom. However, they were given independence by the king, so they're not meddling so much in their affairs. It's going to lose its independence in 63 BC because right now at 145 BC, you can see that Rome only extends out to here. But if I go to the next slide, which is AD 14 years after Christ's birth, you can see that the Roman Empire now extends and includes Judea. So this is what I shouldn't have put before Jesus enters in time, but this is what it looks like right after Jesus enters into time. Something to stress too is that Pontius Pilate hates being stationed here. Basically, everybody hated being in Judea. It was not a friendly place for foreigners, right? The people didn't want foreigners in there. There was no great trade to be had here. All the trade routes went around Jerusalem. It was a backwater. It would be, when you're like Pontius Pilate was stationed there in Jerusalem, it would be like being stationed in the Antarctic, basically. You know, it was not a nice place to be. It didn't have great restaurants. It didn't have great theater like the Greek Empire. It didn't have great art. It just had this kind of nasty people who really didn't want you to be there. And so that does it for 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, next week, I know it says on our, actually in our schedule, I had gotten it off by a week. So I decided that was probably God telling me that before we leap into the New Testament, we should do a review of the Old Testament and tie all the strings together. And that will also give a chance. There were a couple people who dropped out of Old Testament because it was just too violent for them. And so they won't have to read the Old Testament now. And in the summary, I won't have to be so gory as the reading is in the Old Testament. So it'll give them a background, because a couple of people have told me they want to jump into for New Testament. So there won't be any reading for next week, but there will be class, and we'll do our 1 hour review of the Old Testament. And then the week after, we will jump into Luke. So that does it for today. And I am going to stop sharing. And thank you, everybody who will view this on YouTube. And hopefully we'll see you next week for the review of the Old Testament.